Good day, everybody, and welcome to Albuquerque's most iconic businesses, presented by Moji Cinema. My name is Jeffrey Candelaria, and I'm the host of The Gauntlet of Truth and the owner of Connection LLC. Today, I'm excited to talk to Mr. Chet Stewart and Mr. Tom Antram of French Funerals and Cremations. But before we get into the interview, we're going to have a brief and short origin story for your consideration.
My grandfather, Chester T. French, was born in 1882 in East Tennessee. The family lived on a farm and there were 11 children. And he went to Maryville College where he played basketball and football. And he was actually quite a star in sports. And he got his teaching certificate and then he began teaching in a one-room schoolhouse. And while he was teaching, he found out that his brother, Jesse, had tuberculosis. In that time, all they knew to do was to go to a dry climate. So he quit his teaching job and he took his brother on the train and brought him to Albuquerque, New Mexico.
They lived on a small piece of land on a farm on North 12th Street in a tent. And he worked for a lumber company and took care of his brother. But he also got a job digging graves in Fairview Cemetery for a strong funeral home. And that was where he was introduced to the profession of funeral service. And then 3 years later, his brother died of tuberculosis, and he was the one to take his brother back to Tennessee.
So after he took his brother back to Tennessee to be buried, he moved to New York to go to school to get his embalming license so he could come back to New Mexico and go into the business. And in 1907, he started French.
He purchased that business for $4,999, huge amount. He was there for a number of years, and then he decided to move to another building on 4th and Gold. And he called it the French Building. And then he decided to move to Grand Avenue. That building was taken over and condemned when I-25 was built in the late 50s. And he had to move, and so he purchased the land at 1111 University Boulevard Northeast.
In the late 20s, my grandfather went to California and saw Forest Lawn, and it was so beautiful because all the markers were flat and it had a park-like appearance. So he decided he wanted something like that in Albuquerque. So in 1929, he started Sunset Memorial Park.
He purchased some land at Manal and Edith in 1929, and then opened Sunset Memorial Park in 1930. And early on, he began putting together the necessary finances to establish an endowed care fund that would help perpetuate and keep that cemetery beautiful for many years to come.
He felt a great sense of responsibility to the community. And he got involved in so many different ways. He had a flower garden. He taught a Sunday school class for over 40 years at First Methodist Church. Later, he started the French Boy Choir, which actually is still in existence today. It's now called the Albuquerque Boy Choir. Literally, hundreds of boys have learned music through the choir. He wanted to help others like he had been helped himself. And that's kind of the way he lived. He lived outwardly rather than it all being about him. When he discovered something, he wanted to make a gift to the people around him, to the community, to make it all better. In 1966, I got a call from my grandfather, and he told me he wanted me to move to Albuquerque to go in funeral service with him. Now, I loved my grandfather very much. I wasn't really sure that's what I wanted to do, but I decided to come to Albuquerque for a year. And toward the end of that time, I began to realize that funeral service was really a calling for me. And so I had to go to school. So I moved to Dallas, Texas in order to become licensed. Finished the school. I moved back to Albuquerque. on September the 3rd, 1966. And about 3 weeks later, he ran a full-page ad in the newspaper announcing our partnership. And then 3 days after that, he died very suddenly. I had a huge responsibility at a very young age. And I can still remember trying to shave that morning when I found out that he would die, and I was shaking because it was a really scary thing for me at a very young age. It was also a great opportunity as well, and the next few years were really difficult in many ways because I was very young and inexperienced, but fortunately I got help from the people in this organization. We formed a team, and the business gradually began to grow over time.
Every day we have the privilege of serving, of caring, and of remembering. We believe it's important to remember that a life has been lived. A tiny baby, a soldier, a mom, a dad, a life partner. We serve and care for the families in our community, and we lay to rest their loved ones.
The neat thing about this job is you don't do the same thing every day. You don't meet with the same people. Every situation is kind of an adventure. And what a blessing to meet and kind of get to know them and listen to their passions and their love for their mom or their dad, whoever it is we're taking care of.
Every person in the company, regardless of their position, is considered a professional and considered an integral part of what it takes to serve families in multiple different ways, whether it's pets, whether it's families, whether it's pre-need, cemetery, whatever the case may be. There is a sense of oneness, that we are one company, one people serving one family at a time, and it's very integrated, and that adds to this sense of being able to accomplish, being able to serve at very high levels.
These are great people at every level, from the Stewart family all the way through to the groundskeepers in our company, who want to do well, they want to serve, they want to help, and there's nothing like coming to work and being fulfilled, knowing that, number one, I'm making a big difference, and I'm gonna go home tonight and know that, but number two, I'm doing it alongside of phenomenal people, and that is a reward in and of itself.
Our core values are based on what is ethical. And we believe that ethics plays a central role in what this company is. In fact, we are the only funeral home in the state that has received the Ethics in Business Award. And that's really the way we try to operate our business every day, to be honest and ethical in everything we do.
Mr. French had a lot of strong values, and those carried forward through his grandsons and carried forward through other forms of leadership. And when we look for a new person to join our team, we need to first hire to those values. And so more than anything else in our company, it's finding people that have the same servant's heart and giving back not only to the people we serve, but in our community. And then we know we have nailed a match for what a team member needs to be at French. There's not a funeral home in the country that provides the same type of care for a loved one with the same integrity and the same servant's heart that French does in all parts of our company. And we have wonderful people. We have that drive to continually train, to continually learn, to innovate, and it's exciting to know that we are upholding the standards that Mr. French started in 1907 today.
Welcome back, everybody, and I hope you enjoyed the origin story, again brought to you by Moji Cinema, about French funerals and cremations. Today, I'd like to introduce Mr. Chet Stewart and Mr. Tom Antram, again, of French Funerals and Cremations. Welcome to Albuquerque's most iconic businesses, gentlemen.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Well, you know, when I was asked by Mr. Paul Jew to host today's interview, I was extremely gratified because this is personal to me, brand integrity. And I reviewed your history. There was a video that I reviewed prior to today's interview, and I was really struck by the multi-generational kind of thread that you've had almost 100 years, where you continue to stress and embrace brand integrity. Why don't you talk a little bit about that, Tom?
Certainly. So first of all, Chet is the grandson of Mr. French, the founder of our company, and I think it's imperative that as we go through our history, and you mentioned the video, Mr. French founded this company in 1907, and to still be in existence today and still a family, locally owned and operated business, we're very proud of that. And so our DNA has to be attributed to Mr. French and the Stewart family and what has carried forward from group to group within our leadership.
Sure.
But specifically about our brand integrity, there's some non-negotiables that we have to consider every single day. And those non-negotiables are, you can make a lot of mistakes. We're human. And mistakes we can learn from. We can grow, we can coach each other, we can mentor to improve. But integrity, the truth, is a hard line with us. If a person is not being honest, that is a line that we can't cross. If a person makes choices that hurt a family and ultimately the service that we are known for in our community, that is a non-negotiable.
Yeah.
But outside of that, we're very much a graceful company. We want to see people grow and succeed and be part of this family for generations to come.
Yeah. Mr. Stewart, the other thing that struck me about your industry, when people come to you, your clients, your customers, they're trusting you with someone who just deceased, someone who meant something to them, someone who they love probably unconditionally. The entire legacy of that family's reputation in some ways, they entrust to you. Having said that, they're also in a state of emotional distraught. And you have to probably somehow navigate through their emotional position and state of mind and try to talk about some of these practical decisions that they have to make. And obviously there's financial implications tied to that. How do you get into the mind of someone who's so emotionally distraught and obviously embrace trust from your end and try to couple trust on their end?
Well, first of all, you have to have people in your organization that have the gifts and the talents to do that. If they're not gifted and talented to serve that way, it's very difficult for them to be empathetic with the family that comes in. And I've always said, once we're there, we need to kind of, in our minds, change seats with that family so we understand where they're coming from and the hurt that they're feeling. So it's really important that the people that come into our organization not only be people of great character and are very capable of doing the job, but that they have great compassion for the people that they're serving. It's just incredibly important.
So when you hire people, obviously, you have to assess their state of, their capacity for empathy. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's interesting because a lot of times in a conventional work environment, people look at a resume and we're hiring for skill and pragmatics. Mm-hmm. But in your industry, because there's that emotional, visceral element that's there from your clients coming to you with someone who just obviously deceased, the empathy factor, how do you begin to hire to that? And how do you metric that? How do you measure someone's empathy?
Yeah, so you mentioned what most companies hire on skill, on the resume.
Yeah.
And certainly that's a piece of it. But for us, if we flip that around and we're hiring to the person, first and foremost, character. And Chet, I'll attribute this to where it comes from. Chet always talked to us throughout our company's legacy of the 5 C's. And first, it's having character. Is this person a person that it can be truthful, that you can rely on, that can be empathetic and put themselves in the shoes of another person? Do they have the competence? And that competence doesn't mean necessarily the resume, but do they have the ability to learn and grow from that? And from there, it's chemistry. Do we have chemistry that fits our organization for them and vice versa for us?
Like a good fit.
A good fit. That's a great way to put it. And then that ties right into culture, because culture is back to that non-negotiable. It has to fit for our culture. And we have a unique culture in New Mexico.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it's a challenge even bringing people in from other states because that culture doesn't always just match up.
Yeah.
And then lastly, outside of the cultural fit, inside of our organization, we talk a lot about calling because this is a ministry. What we do, as you said, Jeffrey, is helping people at the worst day of their life.
Yeah.
And if it's not a calling for us, if we're not here to serve others the way that it's intended to be, then that just comes across as a job. And that's not what this is.
So, Mr. Stewart, I'd like you to amplify a bit more on culture. For example, all of us are familiar with the iconic company Disneyland, and they do three things: safe, happy, clean. Those are their core values. I happen to go to the Disney School of Management 30 years ago, and I always remember it's so rudimentary, it's so basic, but they never compromise those basic principles of safe, happy, clean. In your business, what are some of the other core values beyond with 5 C's, correct?
Correct.
So what further complements the culture at French?
Well, Tom mentioned the calling, how important that is.
Yeah.
And there really has to be a calling for that, because we can all learn to do things that we may not be called to do. We can learn skills. But what we need to know is what our gifts and talents are. And if we have the gift and talent to fit into that, then we are able to respond appropriately and really serve our families with great compassion.
Sure.
And I've told people many times that I'm so grateful that early on I learned what my gifts and talents were, because it fit what I'm doing. I don't think I would have been happy long serving like I have if I didn't have the gifts and talents to do that. And so if a person doesn't have the gifts and talents, they're not going to last very long.
Sure. So I imagine you have obviously a vetting process to begin with, but there has to be some kind of a period where you're actually viewing, scrutinizing the way that person manifests, not just the skill, not just the pragmatics of the job, but perhaps their empathy, the empathy factor, and also fitting into your culture, the protocols there, the professionalism, the decorum, and then further, just their ability to handle different kinds of clients, because the emotional spectrum, I imagine, is all over the board in terms of your clients coming to you on one of the worst days of their lives. So my point is, there's a period, a grace period, there's a period where you're assessing them over time and making notations and coaching them. How does that dynamic work?
Yeah, I think I'll take you all the way back to that. When we first talk about the 5 C's, is typically as we're getting to know them, the interview process and going through things. We take it a step further as a best practice in our company, is we use a profiling tool called Caliper. And the Caliper breaks down an individual. It's about an hour and a half long test that every employee, every full-time employee in our organization takes. And we use it not only to know how to engage with each other, but also the giftedness, as Chet spoke about, that some people just have innately. Empathy is an area that's actually measured on the Caliper, as well as sociability and gregariousness and leadership practices and so on. So that Caliper is not a deciding factor for us, but it's a factor that we can look at and say, okay, based off of this information that we know, the hardwiring, the DNA that each of us have as human beings, we can learn from that to work with that person and coach and mentor. Once we hire someone, typically, especially here in New Mexico, there's an intern process that goes through before you're a licensed funeral director. Okay. And that's about a year long. And during that year is exactly, Jeffrey, what you just spoke about, the time that we get to stand alongside of them, see their reaction of how they deal with the stress, grieving family members, how we navigate through that. And it gives us an opportunity to coach firsthand each of those individuals so that they see the standards that French has, which isn't always the same as even the rest of our own industry, but the standards that we have and what we expect people to be able to respond to and how to respond. And you know, it's the stress of a grieving family member is easily forgotten when you're busy. Yes. And so we use a video tool that we onboard people with, and that we also show regularly in our company, that says, if only we knew. And in the video, we give example after example of real family scenarios when they're coming into us, and it's 4:59 on Friday afternoon, and you want to go out with your friends Friday night, and here comes a family walking in the door. Yeah. We cannot forget that what they've experienced that day is the worst day of their life. Yeah. And if we only knew to remember that every family walking in our doors is that exact same situation, then that calling comes into play, and 4:59 doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Mr. Stewart, no one really trains the American public. Probably no nation teaches their population how to deal with engaging with a funeral home? What are the options? How do I, intern somebody? We're not taught any of that kind of thing. Bereavement isn't something you graduate from from the client's perspective. So when these folks are coming to you, I imagine they also have various expectations from themselves, perhaps from you. So there's got to be a great deal of counseling going on too, and guidance, which really is that client giving their trust to you, because the average person probably doesn't know what all the options are for their loved one. And then there are also religious implications based on the protocols that maybe the Catholic Church imposes on them. So there's got to be a great deal of exchange, communication, and dialogue during those first interactions with your clients, I imagine.
And one of the things that's really important when we're dealing with them is that we learn who that person was, what their life was like, what they loved to do, their relationships with the community and with their family, and their faith family as well. So you talk to them, get them to talk about what's really important to them, and then that helps you to kind of guide them to do what's really important to them.
Yeah. And Tom, you mentioned this earlier in the interview. Obviously, the industry is highly regulated, I'm surmising, because of obviously the inherent work that you do. You are obviously, in preparing for the interview, have taken industry standards and elevated expectation beyond industry standards, I imagine, based on what I've learned so far. Talk a little bit about that variation from what the minimum standards are for the industry and what French Funeral Cremations does to provide excellence to your clients.
Yeah, I think, I don't mean to say that the industry doesn't have high standards.
Sure,
there are across the
course.
board, and there's a lot of wonderful funeral firms around the country. But we truly believe that we do take it to the next level. And part of that is not only the training and the coaching, but it's also process. You mentioned the Catholic Church, or you could say the Jewish community, or the Buddhist community. We have to be ready and able to know their burial practices, their end of life practices, regardless of what that faith is. And so you can't just show up one day and say, I'm ready to serve the next Buddhist family that walks in, when you have never done that before. So we have processes, written, documented processes for churches around our community, how we help them, how we go through that. And we've worked with clergy members for many, many years throughout our company's history to help formulate those things. So we know what that next level is. We know what the church expects. We know what the family has experienced in the past, if they've experienced a loss before. And if they haven't, we can be the resource to help guide them for the very first time. And that's the next level of the difference between just doing a job and doing it well prepared.
So you're what I'm gleaning here is you're almost empathetic anthropologists, because you're studying
That's a good term.
various cultures, and even those cultures. I was raised Catholic, went to Catholic school, and I remember it was verboten to cremate somebody back in the days of my childhood. And so even the dynamics within anthropologies, cultures, and religions have changed. You've probably seen a bit more. Well, I'll respect you're a little older than Tom, but you have to keep up with all those church and anthropological dynamics that change, evolve as well, to your point.
You bet. And you bring up being Catholic, which I am as well. After Vatican II and the church opening the doors for cremation, that's when cremation rose dramatically across the entire United States. I've been blessed to be part of the French family now for 28 years. But early in my career, we were under 20% cremation as a company. And the state of New Mexico was even a little lower than that. Now we're at 65%. And so that has truly just accelerated. And so that also presents a challenge and an opportunity for us to really help families in new and unique ways.
Excellent. So Chet, let me ask you this. In studying for this interview, or preparing for it rather, your company's been around essentially a century, a little more. I remember in reading the original Mr. French brought a brother here because he had, I believe, tuberculosis. Then that person, the brother that survived, ended up becoming part of the industry and then creating his own company, which obviously you're still part of, obviously. how did that integrity, brand, culture, how did that transition over those generations of ownership, making sure that you preserve the legacy of French, the integrity of French, the culture of French? How was that accomplished over how many generations now? 3, 4, perhaps?
Well, it actually skipped a generation.
Okay.
And I'm the third generation. I'm the one that came along after the one that was skipped. So
the continuity of brand, I guess. How did you maintain that?
Well, Mr. French, my grandfather, was so loved and respected in the community, and he would never compromise on the integrity issues in our company. He would say, "You can make a mistake, but if you violate our code of integrity, there's not going to be a second chance. We can't afford that." So he was really big on expecting the most out of people, and if they made a mistake, there would be some grace, but he expected the integrity aspect to remain intact all the way through. And I saw that happen many times, and we've done it, of course, many times since then. Yeah. We've had people that were very gifted, but they violated our code of integrity, and they could not remain in our company as a result.
So that's a non-negotiable.
It's a non-negotiable for sure.
Yeah, I think that's extremely important. The iconic companies in our world have these non-negotiables, something they're just not going to tolerate. And what are some of the other non-negotiables that you preserve? Because you're expanding, you're growing, you have multiple facilities here. And to maintain that integrity at each of these locations, when you physically can't be there, when Chet can't physically be there, the culture's there, other workers know what the non-negotiables are. But again, what are some of the other non-negotiables, and how do you begin to expand your footprint and again continue to maintain that thread of brand integrity and not compromise it?
I think without formal values, you open up doors to people interpreting whatever they want.
Yeah.
And so we've painstakingly taken time to create values that are meaningful to our company, that also pay tribute and respect to Mr. French and the legacy he began back in 1907. And they're not complicated. And you're going to have to bear with me, because we're also, while we're funeral directors, we like to have a little fun too. And so our values are 3 distinct pieces. It's respect, integrity, and passion. And if you just copy those first letters, that's RIP.
Yeah.
Rest in peace.
Rest in peace.
And so it's easy for us to remember. But respect is all about that can-do attitude, teamwork, working together to serve that family that's walking in the door. Integrity, as Chet talked about, that's the non-negotiable.
Yeah.
We're gonna do what's right, and we're gonna do it regardless if people are watching us or not. That's the internal definition of integrity when we talk about it. Integrity is doing the right thing when no one else is watching.
Yeah.
And passion, the words that we use around passion is servant leadership. And that's the dedication to serve. Back to calling. If your heart's not in serving families, then it's a job, and probably it's not the right thing for you.
Yeah.
But if you're here to help that family through this difficult piece, that servant leadership of helping people through the grieving process, there's nothing more meaningful than that.
Yeah.
For the work of a funeral director. And so those simple 3 values, respect, integrity, passion, are integral to the DNA of our company.
So simple, but each one of those words represents it's almost a paradigm, almost an entire construct. You can dissect passion, and you can create novels just around empathy, feeling, emotion,
Correct.
Understanding. But at the same time, you have to direct these people to do the practical right thing, because they're in such an emotional state of disarray. So to that point, when someone comes to you and they're so emotionally distraught, obviously, you have to guide them as to options, reconciling their financial situation with what options are available. So I guess the word ethic comes to mind, because ethics and integrity are related, but they're a little different, because integrity, I'm thinking, is more along the lines of trust, that kind of thing, where ethics are standards that you can't violate on your side to guide people to do the right thing on their behalf based on options you have, recognizing their emotional situation, what they expect to honor their deceased, but also their financial situation. Yeah. So all that is related to the world of ethics. So you have to train people, your frontline people, to deal with those complex issues too, the ethical issues.
Yeah, and along that line, we have felt as a company that particularly when a family loses an infant or a young person, that's such a critical time. And we made a decision many years ago that we were going to provide a service for that family at no cost, because they're usually young couples who come in and they have much less in the way of resources. And so we provide a service for them at no cost to the community, because it's such a tough time for them. And they're often very surprised when we tell them that's what we're going to do for them. But it's such a blessing for us to use that to minister to the community. It's another way of giving back.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And
this is a bit of a delicate question, but let's just do it, because this is Albuquerque's most iconic businesses, and we want to learn from best practices. Some death is extemporaneous. My mother died in 1969 in a car wreck. One second she's alive, next second she's gone. And I was there, and you guys took care of me at that time, and my family, I'll never forget it. But the other kind of death is anticipated. So now you have a family who comes to you and knows my unfortunate, or my grandfather's had cancer for 6 months. So they anticipated the death. It's still difficult, no question, but it's a different sense of perhaps their preparation versus what I call a sudden, all death, a sudden, but an extemporaneous death, an accident, a car wreck, that kind of thing, a gunshot wound. You have those different kinds of clients that you see as well, and I imagine the person who lost somebody like that unexpectedly, their emotional profile is probably a little different, I'm conjecturing here, than somebody who may have anticipated a death, particularly if someone's a bit older. Is that fair?
You're spot on. It's the shock. Today Dad drove off in the car, and I expected to see him tonight when he usually comes home, and something happens, an accident. And so that families, when they experience that kind of immediate loss, they're in complete shock, and we have to make sure that we're guiding them at that time. We can't overwhelm families. We make sure that it's on their pace, so we don't try to rush the process to get decisions made. We want to walk through with them slowly, so that they can either get friends that can help them make those decisions, or that we can be that resource through time. And I would tell you, Jeffrey, that this is where one of the things that separates us from many of our peers around the country is, years ago we invested in a full-time grief counselor on staff. And that grief counselor is free of charge to the families we serve. And this is where she really earns her gold, so to speak, as she helps families. And so when families are hurting in this way, she'll talk to them right away and help guide them through a process. And she'll meet with them multiple times if the family desires. And if they need it, she can help reference them to a more permanent relationship with a counselor. But that sometimes just pausing and stepping away from the business to give them care that they need is the biggest thing that we can do.
That's a great point. Emotional venting, just letting people cry, letting people grieve, letting people be emotional. So I imagine that in your business, you have to hire people that are also very good listeners, and probably patience might couple that kind of skill set, patience, listening skills, that kind of thing.
absolutely.
You're spot on once again. That it's such a delicate piece to hire to, and we've made mistakes, as any business has. But we do our best to be very, very methodical and thought out on the hiring side of things, because if we match those 5 C's, if we match our values, now it fits. And we can teach the skills to do the job, to show up and take care of families every day. But if you have to have that heart. Yeah. And if we've done nothing else but take our time in hiring, then we're going to serve families well.
Chet, you've been in the business a number of years, obviously. Tom, you have as well. What have you seen that's changed in the industry that you were comfortable with, if you're okay with answering that question? And what have you seen change in the industry that you've embraced and taken to the heights of the brand at French, family funerals and cremation?
Well, we've lost, to be real honest with you, we've lost some of the community that we used to have. There used to be a great deal of involvement, and civic organizations in the community and that sort of thing. We don't have as much of that. That's concerning to us because those are in addition to people's faith, their community organizations are really important. And although we do still see some of it, not nearly as much as we used to. And you've seen a lot of organizations disappear because of that, because people are not as involved as they used to be with their neighbors and with their community.
So you're saying people have become more, well, it's obvious, but hearing it from you, you're corroborating what I've surmised. People have become a bit more insular.
That's right.
Okay.
Well, they become couch potatoes. They, instead of being involved in their community, they're home watching television all the time.
Okay.
And it's unfortunate in many ways.
And what are the implications for your business when folks are perhaps a bit more monolithic, more insular, more, forgive me, one-dimensional perhaps, not that everyone is, but insular lifestyles have implications versus being communal.
Yeah, communal is the right word. When you're part of community, when you belong to different organizations, church, faith communities, whatever that may be, there's a need for you to be honored and remembered, but there's also a need for those people that come and do that, to come around you and support. So what we've seen sometimes when people are isolated or insular, as you said, is there's almost a void. And you may have a family member you're dealing with from another city because they don't have family here. And sometimes it's a painful thing to observe, that there's not the community around them to help them through the next time.
Yeah.
And I think that's a challenge. The part to also answer your question, I think the other part that is a positive thing for all of our community is the move from typical funeral to we can do anything we want. And I think that's been a positive thing in our profession.
Yeah.
And certainly right here in Albuquerque is there's a lot of things people can do to honor and remember their loved one. It's not just show up at church and do the same service that we did for Grandpa.
That reminds me of 64, Vatican II, III, whatever that was, when the church was able to, the Catholic Church, I'm just using that as a metaphor for an entire paradigm. Remember before that it was spoken in Latin? Yep. The priest had his back to you. Yep. So the Vatican said, no, you've got to celebrate more with folk, make it more communal. There was even some music involved. So church became more celebratory. So in your industry, if we can use a parallel kind of a construct there for liberty to an industry, people have more options to celebrate the legacy of their deceased, as opposed to, the old-fashioned just in a coffin, see you later, goodbye kind of thing.
Exactly.
And not to minimize or reduce the importance of that.
No. I was reading an obituary this morning for a family, and they were talking about all the things that this gentleman had been part of. And it comes back to the changes that we're seeing. Sure. He had been in Elks, he had been in Rotary, he had been part of Lions, he had been part of his church community. And so that list, while it was so long, you saw that impact. Yeah. And sometimes when we're insulated, we don't see that impact. We don't realize the people that we have influenced throughout our time here on earth. Yeah. And I think that's the important piece that people also need to remember is we do have impact. Every life is important and worthy of honor and respect. And we need to be able to honor those families in that way.
I'd like both of you to answer this question. In America, especially as a highly industrial, commercialized kind of enterprise America, we're not really taught, particularly men, maybe it's a little more relaxed, to deal with emotion, okay? Have you seen a change in the way people manifest, manage, express emotion, maybe 40 years ago, 30 years ago? I'd like both of you to answer that. Chet, you want to start with how we deal with emotion?
It's really interesting. When I was brought up, I knew my dad loved me, but he never said, I love you.
Sure.
He would say, I love my family. But it was, and men didn't really cry in public particularly because that wasn't considered to be manly. And we've seen a change in that. And I think that's really a positive. Yeah. And I've often told people when you share your joys, they're multiplied, but when you share your sorrows, they're divided. And it really is true. You think about that. And it's really important that we share our sorrows. Yeah. And there's nothing wrong with crying. A tear is a wonderful thing. It's a blessing, really.
Yeah. I think it reminds us how vulnerable we are and how much we really, in the final analysis, have in common. Yeah. And I think it reminds us of our vulnerability. So it should remind us how connected we are and perhaps should be. That's just a thought.
I like it. Right on.
So your perspectives on how folks have dealt with emotion, just, you worked in the industry, what, 30 years?
Yeah, close to that, 28 years. But as Chet said, I think there has been some of the generational shifts in the acceptance of being vulnerable.
Yeah.
Because there's many generations they weren't vulnerable. This is how we do it, and this is what we do. I think what's happening now and what we're seeing more of is that even the next generations, the millennials and the generations beyond that, they want hands-on. Yeah. And so they want to be part of the process. And that hasn't always been the case in funeral service. Before we show up at a church, we do it, using Catholic Church example, we have a mass, and we know exactly what's going to happen going forward. But today, the family wants to be part of that process. And so in the ways that we are able with churches and having other celebrations of life, including them in parts of that opens up the doors to their own grief process, because that's part of it. They need to say goodbye.
Tom, you remind me of another thought, and that is you're dealing with not just baby boomers like us, the greatest generation. You're not quite that old, sir, but you understand the various populations that grow up in different segments of lifespan. So you probably, I imagine, have to hire Generation Z folk, some millennial folk, not to be too stereotypical, but each of those generations have their own sensibilities, have their own things that are important as far as prioritizations are concerned. Is that fair? And do you hire to different segments of the life cycle as well?
Most definitely. Like every business, we look at our community and we want to be a reflection of our community. And so we look at the demographics, both generationally, but also racial demographics and age demographics, to see, are we fitting that? Yeah. And the stereotypical, what most people think of when they think of a funeral director is the old man in the white hat or the black top hat. And that's not funeral service any longer. And so we've done a very good job of matching that. Yeah. We have a number of young people. We have a lot of women in our organization that serve families, and they're very gifted at doing that. And we want to make sure that we are matching what our community looks like to the best extent that we can. Yeah. And finding the best people, back to that 5 C's in our mission.
Part of your culture, part of the non-negotiables, brand integrity. Well, gentlemen, Mr. Chet Stewart, Mr. Tom Antram, it's been a pleasure. I mean, I've learned so much. I thought I prepared, but I've been enlightened as to what you're about in terms of the industry, your non-negotiables. And I'm so gratified to know that your business is here in Albuquerque and you're a vanguard in the industry. On that behalf, on behalf of Albuquerque's most iconic businesses and Moji Cinema, I'd like to present you with this little iconic tribute based on your 100 years of doing great business in Albuquerque.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And we're just proud to be considered as one of Albuquerque's most iconic.
We are.
And we're just proud to be considered as one of Albuquerque's most iconic.
We are.
All right, very good. Well, we have Chet and Tom here. And if you have any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat or the question and answer section, and Chet and Tom will do their best to answer them. There were a couple of questions that came in prior to this that I'd like to ask of each of you. One of the things that happened when we were working on your origin story, of course, we talked about the history of French funerals and cremations, but we really didn't go into very much detail about your personal origin story. So Chet, start with you. Tell us a little bit about your personal origin story, and your childhood and any significant things that occurred when you were growing up.
Well, I grew up in a fairly large family. There were 6 of us, And I was number 2 out of the 6. And I always tell people, because I was number 2, we have to try harder. Number 2s do try harder, I guess. But really brought up in a wonderful family. I just have such great memories of my childhood. And actually, we lived in Albuquerque when I was small. And then my father started a business in El Paso, and we moved to El Paso. That's where I went to grade school. And then I went on to, after I finished school there, went on and graduated from college. I went to Wheaton College in Illinois. And then following that, I went into the service. I went through ROTC while I was in college. Because back when I was younger, there was the draft, and I thought, well, I'm going to be in the military, so I would prefer to be an officer. So that's why I went through ROTC, and it was a great experience for me. I felt like I learned a lot of leadership skills while I was there, which really blessed me later on when I was thrown into a leadership responsibility here at French's.
Excellent, good. So that, I guess, after college in Illinois and then the military with ROTC, what was the transition between that and getting involved with French?
Well, my grandfather called me about 6 months before I got out of the military, and he said, I want you to move to Albuquerque and go into business with me. And at the time, I really wasn't sure it was exactly what I wanted to do, but I loved my grandfather dearly. And so I agreed to come for a year. And I don't think he heard the year part, but as I said earlier, it turned out that it really fit my gifts and talents. And so once I decided to stay, my grandfather told me that he would sell me a third interest in the business. And at the same time, I asked him for an option to buy his interest because I didn't want to be left with a minority interest, which he gave me. And when I finished school in September of 1966, as I said earlier, I came back to Albuquerque, and 3 weeks, well, actually 2 weeks later, he ran this full page ad in the paper and then died 3 days later. It was a big shock to me, but I was really grateful for the leadership training that I received while I was in the military. That was very, very helpful to me to begin leading this business. And I was very young and had a lot to learn, but we had great people who came alongside me, and so we were blessed to build a wonderful business.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chet. How about you, Tom? Tell us a little bit about your background and your history.
Certainly. So I'm a native New Mexican. I was born and raised in Alamogordo, and like Chet, I come from a big family. I'm the baby of 8 children.
Wow.
And so I have siblings scattered all over the country, and 2 sisters that still live in my hometown. Mom and Dad still there at 92 and 88. So I get down to Alamogordo frequently to check in on them. But after growing up and graduating in Alamogordo, I went to New Mexico State for a couple of years of college. And being so close to home, that was a disastrous affair for myself. And so I made the choice to transfer to the University of New Mexico, and that's when I journeyed to Albuquerque. And my brother worked for French before I ever thought about funeral service as a career. So he was my first introduction into what the funeral business was. But my junior year of college, there was an ad in the Daily Lobo, and then it was confirmed through my connection into the business as my brother, was to live above the funeral home here on University. And you could live for free if you answered phones at night. And I had chose to marry my college sweetheart while we were still in school, taking the difficult path, and we were paying for our own education. So we got married June 19th of 1993 and moved into the apartment upstairs here above the funeral home July 4th weekend. And so that was our first real apartment together as a married couple. And so I was on campus, so to speak, frequently, and they continued to ask me to do odd end jobs, change the oil on the cars in the weekend, wash cars, deliver flowers on services. And about 6 months before I graduated from UNM, Chet, because he always saw me walking around the place and we had gotten to know each other, he asked me in the hallway if I had ever considered funeral service. And at that point, I had not. And Chet said, you know, Tom, I think you'd be really good if you would think about this. And why don't you spend some time in the back? And the back for us is caring for decedents in the embalming room. And he said, if you can do that, I think you owe it to yourself to try it. And so that was my nudge in the right direction. And I've always attributed that to Chet, that had he not said something, I don't know that I would have sought that, but that opened up the doors. I saw the care and dignity that was given to deceased. I started working services and seeing how families were impacted every single day. And I fell in love with that. And so after my wife graduated from UNM with a nursing degree, we moved to Dallas, Texas, so that I could go to mortuary school, and came right back to French and have been here my entire career. So it has been a blessing to me and my family throughout.
Yeah. So when you were living above the funeral home in the apartment, did you get very many calls in the middle of the night?
Oh, yes. That's it. And you know, back then we didn't have cell phones. So when you were on physically in the space. And so it was, you had to be manned and ready to answer that phone.
All right. Neat. So tell us a little bit about, once you came back from Dallas and you joined French, describe a bit of your career progression so that maybe those who might be interested in getting into the funeral industry kind of understand maybe some of the progression that's available to them if they decide that this is a career that they would like to pursue.
Certainly. So going back to before I left to Dallas, you know, that in New Mexico, you do an internship. And that internship can happen before you go to the university or after. It just depends on where you're at. So I did my internship before I went to mortuary school. When I came back, I became a licensed funeral director within just a few months of returning. But I worked in the care center, the embalming room, and made transfers, which is picking up decedents from all over the city and taking care of them during that time before I became trained and started serving families face to face as a funeral director. And so you get exposed to different areas within that. So prep room, transfers, funeral director. Along the way, French opened up a new business back in 1998, and it was a funeral home that we called Aspen Funeral Alternatives. And it was a different take on our funeral profession as a whole, and different than French, offering different types of services, more simplistic. And so I had the opportunity to start that business back in 1998. We learned an awful lot from it. We made mistakes. It's a business that ultimately failed in the grand scheme of things, but that was my education in how to market the business, how to be out in the community for a business, how to do everything, because I had hands-on every single part of the company at that point. But when Aspen was beginning to transition, I was able to come back and take a supervisory role at French, not only overseeing Aspen, but also our care center at that point. And then ultimately got into leadership and management of the funeral homes, and became an owner back in 2010 and became the CEO in 2011. So it's been a long transition over 28 years. And as I said, it's been a huge blessing and an opportunity to serve in a lot of different ways.
Excellent. So
Paul, I would just like to say that we could see early on that Tom had real gifts and talents to do what he's doing today. And he has done almost everything in our business that a person could do. So he's had great experience in starting basically at the bottom and moving all the way up until now. He's the CEO of our company and doing an amazing job.
excellent. Thank you very much. Another question that was brought to my attention prior to today's webinar was, what are some of the daily or weekly or quarterly or whatever period of time rituals that French does to maintain and sustain the culture that you've built over the years? How do you, what are maybe some practical things that you do to make sure that the culture is sustained and maintained?
You bet. So I'll start with our leadership group, because I think it has to be fostered within the leadership group before it can come out to the entire company. And so we have regular monthly meetings as an entire leadership. And what I define leadership as is every manager and supervisor within our family of companies. So Sunset Memorial Park, French Funerals, Cremation Society, and Best Friends. So it's a group of about 15 of us. We meet every month. We do three things. We have a leadership development, which is training for ourselves. How do we become better leaders? How do we foster growth within our teams? We do work to keep our strategy. That's the second part. How are we doing with our goals and initiatives? Are we driving forward? What obstacles are we facing? And we talk about those things openly. And then lastly, it's a team building piece. We share a lot of vulnerability as a team. And so every month we get together and say, how are we doing on a personal level and on a business level on a scale from 1 to 10? And I've been very proud of our team of how vulnerable we've been able to be together to share some of the obstacles that we're facing personally that affect business, and or vice versa in some cases, especially during COVID, and it was a little crazy. Business could affect personal. And so we start there. But the other part of that then is how we celebrate, how we encourage our teams. I'll be very candid with you. During COVID, we haven't done a very good job of that over the last year. It's been a challenge with the mandates and restrictions that we had to be face to face with people. It's also been a challenge because it was a busier time in our business, and so being able to pause and celebrate people's lengths of service and get together. We typically have had all employee meetings on a regular basis. We didn't over the last year. And so next month, we're getting back together for the first time since February of 2020 as an all employee group, some in person, some will be able to watch it via live stream. But we haven't been able to really be together to celebrate those things. And that's part of our culture. We have to be able to acknowledge those milestones within our careers across the board. And so we know we have some work to do in those areas, but that's an ever-going and present process for us.
Excellent. Do you have anything to add to that, Chet?
Well, as you may know, Paul, I'm retired, but I still occasionally help, particularly when I know people who've had a death in their family, because it's just a part of the business that I've always loved. I love the interaction with people and helping them through the difficult time. But no, it's just a blessing to watch and see how things are being done now. And I'm just really amazed at how well Tom's leading us.
Wonderful. Another question that was brought was someone asked, are there any books that you have read that have been things that would be helpful for either a leader or for a business owner that have been very impactful for each of you that you would recommend maybe somebody else to read?
Want to start?
Well, I would just say, and it's been a little while since I've read this book, but there was a book written a few years ago called Good to Great. And I think in the book that preceded it, I'm trying to think of the name of it, the same author, but a great book that was just a great inspiration for me and really helped me back in the days when I was leading the company. It was just awesome. Built to Last is the other book.
Jim Collins.
Jim Collins is the author, right?
And there's so many good books, and when you look behind Chet, there's a whole slew of books on the mantelpiece that we read, and we try to use one or two things from each of the books as practice. But the most recent book that I've read that was impactful for me is The Power of Habit. It's by Charles Duhigg, and just it's an outstanding read. But it talks about how habits form our abilities to really be innovative, to challenge the culture, not only for yourself, but within your companies, and then to really cultivate teams. And so it's been that's a most recent, and then one in our world, in our industry, and actually written by somebody that Chet and I have known for many, many moons, and his father used to work in our cemetery for over 30 years. His mother worked in our front office for 20 some odd years. He happens to be in a marketing world, but his name is Eric Layer, and he wrote a book called The Right Way of Death. And it's a book that challenges many of the assumptions within our profession and has helped kind of broaden the horizon for a lot of people. And we were integral in being able to read that, give feedback as he was writing. And I've been extremely proud of what he came out with. And I've shared it with so many different people, both inside and outside of the funeral profession, because it has very good, solid principles of how we need to do things and how we need to challenge our normal ways of assisting each other.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And then a final question that was raised was, what do both of you enjoy to do outside of work? What are some of your passions outside of work?
Well, I often tell people that I'm the biggest Lobo fan that never went to the University of New Mexico. Although my wife is an alumnus, and I have 3 sons that are graduates of UNM as well. And so I love Lobo athletics, and we hardly miss a game in football or basketball, and we go to some of the other sports as well as baseball, volleyball. We just love UNM sports, and so we're big fans of our UNM Lobos.
Excellent.
Paul, if you ever get a chance to go to a game with Chet, you're going to see this. He gets fired up and his hands start going, and we joke with him often about that, but he really is a big Lobo fan. And so for me, I am proud. I'm a proud Lobo, and now I've just graduated my entire family full of Lobos. So both of my daughters graduated from UNM. My youngest just graduated Saturday, so we're celebrating that all 4 of us in our small family are Lobos. But what we love to do is get out and hike. Carrie, my wife, and I, and we have 3 dogs. We like to just get out. It doesn't matter where, if it's the petroglyphs, if it's Sandias, Manzanos, up in the Jemez. We just like to get out in New Mexico because this is a beautiful place to be from and to live, and we're just blessed to have that. So that's my passion outside of this.
Well, I want to thank both of you for joining us today, and again, just congratulations on all that you've done to build your business and maintain it all these years, and being such a credit to Albuquerque. And again, blessings to both of you and your families, and to French Funerals and Cremations. Again, thank you very much, Tom and Chet, for joining us today, and we hope to see you soon.
Thank you so much, Paul. Blessings.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.